The name is Bootsy, baby. Bootzilla, that is. Bootzilla! And when he said it, 75% business, 25% music. I didn't understand that because I was so into the music, I didn't have no grip on the business.
In 1978, Bootsy Collins stood at #1 on the R&B charts with Bootzilla, dressed like a cartoon superhero with a star-shaped bass, selling records and defining what funk could look like when it stopped apologizing. 47 years later, that same kid who got clowned for wearing Goodwill hand-me-downs wakes up on a lakeside estate outside Cincinnati, walks past his own fishing pond and basketball court, and steps into a home studio called The Ark. No tour bus, no late-night club money, just walls lined with portraits of Michael Jackson and Prince, and a street sign down the road with his name on it. But here's the thing folks don't talk about. Bootsy didn't crash out, didn't go broke, didn't fade because the industry chewed him up. He just decided the mothership could land for good. In 2019, on doctor's orders, he announced he'd never play bass on stage again. And instead of mourning, he doubled down on the foundation work, the mentoring, the King Records preservation fight, building a quiet kind of royalty that doesn't need a stage. Because sometimes the biggest power move isn't staying famous. It's knowing when to come home and own the whole block. Before the lakeside compound and the street signs, before the star-shaped bass and the gold records, there was just a skinny Cincinnati kid named William Earl Collins, born in 1951, moving from apartment to apartment every time the rent came due. The neighborhood around Evanston wasn't handing out dreams. It was handing out survival lessons, and young Bootsy learned most of his in the hallways of schools where kids had sharp eyes and sharper tongues. His clothes came from the Goodwill bins and the Salvation Army racks, mismatched colors, and two big shoes that squeaked when he walked, and every morning felt like walking onto a stage he never auditioned for. The laughter followed him like a soundtrack he couldn't turn off. Kids pointing at the patchwork pants and faded jackets, making sure he knew he didn't belong in their world of name brands and matching outfits. Most kids would have shrunk, would have tried to blend into the lockers and disappear, but something in Bootsy's head flipped the script. If they were going to look anyway, he figured, might as well give them something to see. He started mixing those mismatched colors on purpose, turning the shame into a costume, a character, a walking comic book panel that said, "Yeah, I see you looking, and I'm just getting started." Years later, he'd tell interviewers that once he started treating those Salvation Army fits like art, the laughter didn't stop, but the power shifted, because now he was in control of the image they were laughing at. That philosophy, that defiant remix of poverty into style, would become the blueprint for Bootzilla, for the star glasses and the platform boots, for every rhinestone cape he'd ever wear on a stage. But clothes were just the warm-up. Music was the escape hatch. Cincinnati in the 1960s still had the heartbeat of King Records pulsing through the streets, the label that had made James Brown and the Isley Brothers into gods, and young Bootsy soaked it all in, dreaming in bass lines and backbeats. By his late teens, he'd formed a group called the Pacemakers with his brother Catfish, grinding through local clubs where the lights were dim and the pay was almost invisible, but the groove was real. Those stages taught him how to lock into a rhythm, how to make a room move even when nobody knew his name, how to turn four strings into a conversation that didn't need words. He wasn't famous yet, wasn't even close, but every night in those smoky Cincinnati rooms, he was building something bigger than a band. He was building a universe. Cincinnati stages were too small for what he was building inside his head, and in 1969, a phone call from the Godfather himself would turn those cartoon dreams into boot camp reality. James Brown didn't ask, he summoned, and when the Godfather of Soul needed a new band in 1969, the Pacemakers got the call that most musicians would kill for and some would live to regret. Overnight, Bootsy and his brother Catfish went from Cincinnati club circuit to the center of the tightest, most unforgiving funk machine on the planet. Rechristened as the JBs, James Brown's new backing unit. It should have felt like a dream. 18-year-old Bootsy holding down the low end on tracks that would define the next decade of black music. His bass rumbling under "Get Up, I Feel Like Being a Machine," and a string of early 70s funk classics that still rattle car trunks today. But dreams don't come with fines, and James Brown's stage did. The rehearsal rooms felt like military drills, Brown prowling the floor with cigarette smoke trailing behind him, counting off beats with the precision of a drill sergeant who'd court-martial you for being a 16th note late. There was a notebook, always a notebook, where infractions got logged and paychecks got docked. $5 for a missed cue, $10 for a wrinkled shirt, $20 if you dared look bored while the Godfather was teaching the world how to feel like a sex machine. Bootsy's bass buzzed under fluorescent lights, his fingers moving faster than his thoughts, trying to stay on the one, stay in the pocket, stay out of that notebook. It was boot camp disguised as a gig, trauma dressed up as opportunity, the kind of pressure that either breaks you or forges you into something harder than you ever planned to be. And it worked. The discipline seeped into Bootsy's DNA, the understanding that funk wasn't just feeling, it was architecture. Every note placed with the kind of intention that separated legends from wannabes. He learned how to lead a groove, how to make a single bass line carry an entire song, how to turn restraint into power. But he also learned what it felt like to be a cog in someone else's machine. Brilliant but replaceable, essential but never equal. Years later, he'd describe those James Brown years as both the best school he ever attended and the reason he vowed never to be just another sideman under somebody else's iron fist. By 1971, the lessons had been learned and the cost had been paid, and when the financial tensions and the endless rules finally snapped something inside him, Bootsy walked. No dramatic blow-up, no public feud, just a quiet exit from the tightest band in the world because he'd figured out that being great for someone else wasn't the same as being free. When George Clinton called talking about spaceships, parliaments, and funk without rules, Bootsy didn't hesitate. George Clinton's world was the opposite of everything James Brown had built. A place where the rules were made up every night, and the only sin was being boring. In 1972, Bootsy walked into the Parliament Funkadelic Collective and found a circus, a spaceship, a church, and a comic book, all rolled into one sweaty, glitter-covered experiment in what happened when black musicians stopped asking permission and started building their own mythology. Clinton didn't want another tight, disciplined bassist. He wanted a character, an alien, a cartoon made flesh, and Bootsy had been sketching that character in his head since the Goodwill days. This was the sandbox he'd been looking for. A place where the star-shaped bass wasn't too much, where the rhinestones and platform boots weren't a joke, but a requirement, where Bootzilla could finally land. The mothership shows became the stuff of legend. Stages filled with props that looked like they'd crashed out of a blaxploitation sci-fi fever dream. And Bootsy right at the center of it. Cape flowing, star sunglasses catching the stage lights. Bass slung low like a weapon from another dimension. Backstage before those shows, you could feel the electricity. George Clinton moving through the crowd like a ringmaster egging everyone on, and Bootsy strapping on that space bass, knowing that once he stepped out there, he wasn't William Collins anymore. He was Bootzilla, funk superhero, cartoon brought to life, the low-end voice of a generation that wanted to dance and think and trip all at once. The crowd roar that hit when he walked out wasn't just applause. It was confirmation that the kid who got laughed at for his clothes had turned himself into the coolest thing on any stage in America. By 1976, he'd earned enough shine to step out front, forming Bootsy's rubber band and landing a deal that let him be both P-Funk family and solo star. The debut, Stretchin' Out in Bootsy's Rubber Band, hit number 10 on the R&B albums chart, proof that the character could carry a record without George's name on the cover. Then, 1977 hit like a bass bomb. Ah, the Name is Bootsy, Baby climbed all the way to number 1 on the R&B chart and went gold. The kind of success that turns a persona into a phenomenon. Radio couldn't get enough of that rubbery, bouncing low end, DJs in black clubs from Detroit to Atlanta spinning it until the grooves wore thin. And suddenly, every kid with a bass wanted to know how Bootsy made 4 strings sound like a spaceship taking off. Then came 1978, the year Bootsy owned everything. Bootsy, Player of the Year, hit number 1 on the R&B albums chart, went gold again, and the single Bootzilla climbed to number 1 on the R&B singles chart. A trifecta that proved the cartoon wasn't just fun, it was commerce, it was culture, it was the sound of funk at its most free and most dominant. For 4 years, from 1976 to 1980, Bootsy Collins was untouchable, a star in his own right, still anchored to the P-Funk mothership, but flying his own missions, selling records, and redefining what a bass player could be. George Clinton had given him the platform, but Bootsy built the rocket himself. By 1982, though, the mothership was running out of fuel, and the world was changing frequencies. The signs were everywhere if you knew where to look. Radio programmers started switching formats. MTV launched in 1981 with a playlist that looked nothing like the funk that had dominated Black America for a decade, and suddenly the bass lines that had moved bodies from coast to coast sounded like relics from a different era. It wasn't that Bootsy got worse or the music lost its power. It was that the entire infrastructure shifted beneath his feet. Disco backlash bleeding into funk, new wave and synth pop taking over the visual real estate that MTV controlled, and an industry that decided the future looked whiter, younger, and a whole lot less funky. In 1982, Bootsy released The One Giveth, The Count Taketh Away, the final album of his Warner Brothers run, and you could feel it in the title alone. That understanding that something was being taken that he couldn't fight with just a better bass line. The numbers told the story, the music couldn't. Albums that would have been automatic gold a few years earlier now struggled to find shelf space. Radio stations that had championed P-Funk and Bootsy's Rubber Band flipped to formats that didn't have room for 7-minute funk odysseys. And the major label machine that had funded those elaborate stage shows and album campaigns quietly started looking elsewhere. Bootsy's post-1982 discography reads like a map of someone navigating a collapsing empire. Smaller labels, side projects, live albums, experimental collaborations, all brilliant, but all operating without the industry muscle that had pushed Bootzilla to number 1. This wasn't a personal failure, this was structural. An entire generation of funk pioneers found themselves on the wrong side of a cultural shift that had nothing to do with talent and everything to do with formats, with MTV's gatekeeping power, with an industry that decided what black music should sound like in the Reagan years, and funk didn't make the cut. Bootsy went from major label budgets and chart dominance to indie hustle and cult hero status, not because he stopped being brilliant, but because the game changed the rules mid-play. If the 80s taught Bootsy anything, it was how to pivot. And by the 90s, a whole new generation was about to discover his bass lines, one sample at a time. Hip-hop didn't ask permission, it just took what it needed, and by the early 90s, producers were digging through crates of P-Funk and Bootsy records, like archaeologists uncovering gold. Dr. Dre and the G-Funk wave turned those 70s bass lines into the foundation of West Coast rap, chopping up Flashlight and Bootsy's rubbery grooves until a whole generation of kids who'd never seen the mothership knew exactly what that low end felt like. Suddenly, Bootsy was everywhere and nowhere at once, his sound bumping out of car speakers from Compton to Brooklyn. But his face wasn't on the album covers. His name was in the liner notes. a footnote that came with royalty checks and a strange kind of immortality. It wasn't the same as being number one on the R&B charts, but it was something more durable, proof that the music he'd made 20 years earlier still had power, still had currency, still had the ability to move bodies even when the industry had moved on. While hip-hop was sampling his past, Bootsy was busy inventing new futures. Between 1988 and 1995, he popped up on Columbia Records and a string of indie labels, diving into experimental projects like Praxis and Zillotron that sounded nothing like the Rubber Band, but everything like a man refusing to be boxed in. These weren't comeback attempts, they were reinventions, collaborations with avant-garde musicians and electronic producers who understood that Bootsy had never been about one sound. He'd always been about freedom. The cult hero status fit him better than the mainstream ever did anyway. A space where he could be weird and revered at the same time, where the star glasses weren't a costume, but a philosophy. Then came 1997, and Prince himself stepped up to induct Parliament Funkadelic into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. The ultimate validation that what they'd built in the 70s wasn't just a moment, it was a monument. Bootsy stood on that stage in Cleveland not as a relic, but as a recognized architect of American music, alongside George Clinton and the whole P-Funk family. The Goodwill Kid now canonized in the same institution that held James Brown and every other legend who'd ever made the bass speak. But the wildest resurrection was still coming. In 2001, Bootsy stepped into a vocal booth to cut lines for a British DJ named Fatboy Slim, his voice rolling over big beat electronic production that had nothing to do with funk, but everything to do with groove. The song was called Weapon of Choice, and when Spike Jonze directed a video starring Christopher Walken gliding and spinning through an empty hotel lobby, surreal and hypnotic and utterly unforgettable, it became one of the defining visuals of the early 2000s. The track hit number 10 on the UK singles chart. The video went into heavy rotation on MTV2, and in 2002, it won the Grammy for Best Short-Form Music Video, putting Bootsy's voice back into the global conversation in a way that felt both strange and inevitable. A whole new generation encountered him not through samples or history lessons, but through their TV screens, that raspy voice cutting through electronic beats, proving that he could live in any era, any genre, any format that understood the universal language of groove. By the 2000s, Bootsy had proven he could live in any era, but back in Cincinnati, he was building something the world couldn't see yet, a life that didn't need applause to feel whole. The estate sits just outside Cincinnati, far enough from the city noise that you can hear birds over the water, close enough that the kid who moved every time rent came due could still see the skyline that raised him. By 2018, when Cincinnati Magazine came out to document what Bootsy had built, the property looked less like a rock star mansion and more like a self-contained universe. A fishing pond stocked and waiting, a basketball court where nephews and neighborhood kids could run, a guest house where his mother had lived until she passed, and at the center of it all, a home studio he called The Ark. The name wasn't just cute, it was intentional. A place where the music could survive whatever flood the industry threw at it. Walls lined with painted portraits of Michael Jackson, Prince, Alice Cooper, Bob Dylan, all the legends who'd figured out how to make it on their own terms. This was wealth that didn't need to flash, security that didn't need to perform, the kind of freedom that only comes when you stop chasing what the world thinks success should look like and start building what feels like home. But the real work wasn't happening in the studio. It was happening in schools and community centers. Kids who'd never heard of Parliament Funkadelic getting instruments and second chances because Bootsy and his wife Patty decided that giving back wasn't optional. In 2011, the same year he released The Funk Capital of the World, with features from Snoop Dogg and other new school players, he formalized the Bootsy Collins Foundation, focusing on bullied kids, dental care for underserved families, and getting instruments into the hands of children who couldn't afford them. Patty became the operational engine, the one interviews described as really standing up and running the programs, building out initiatives like Say It Loud, an instrument for every child, while Bootsy provided the vision and the star power to open doors. It was a partnership that mirrored their life, him as the dreamer and the draw, her as the architect who turned dreams into infrastructure. By 2017, the mentoring mission had become as important as the music itself. Worldwide Funk featured younger artists like Kaylee Uchis and Alicia, not just as guests, but as proof that the funk wasn't dying, it was evolving, and Bootsy wanted to be the bridge instead of the gatekeeper. In interviews around that album, he kept coming back to the same idea: funk as healing music, sound as medicine for a world that had forgotten how to groove. He told journalists he liked having younger people around him, that he didn't need to be the focal point anymore, that passing the torch felt better than hoarding the flame. It was the opposite of how James Brown had run things, the opposite of the ego-driven grind that burned out so many of his peers. He'd built a fortress of peace, a studio kingdom, and a network of kids carrying his mission forward. But in 2019, his body delivered the message he'd been ignoring. It was time to stop. The doctors didn't sugarcoat it. Pressure on the inner ear, strain on the right hand. The kind of wear that comes from 50 years of making a bass do things it was never designed to do. And the message was clear: keep playing live and risk permanent damage, or walk away while you still can. In January 2019, Bootsy sat in the Ark at night, the studio quiet except for the hum of equipment that had witnessed 1,000 sessions, laptop glowing in the dark as he composed a Facebook message that would end one life and confirm another. His fingers hovered over the keys, not from pain but from the weight of what he was about to say, that the bass that had carried him from James Brown's boot camp to P-Funk glory to Lakeside Peace would never be played on a stage again. He typed the line that hurt most: "I know you are disappointed, just think for a moment how I feel," because he knew what it meant to the fans who'd traveled to see him, who'd waited decades for one more chance to watch Bootzilla live. But this wasn't a tragedy, it was a choice, and that distinction mattered. At 67, Bootsy wasn't dependent on the touring economy that kept so many of his peers grinding until their bodies gave out on stage. He had the estate, the royalties, the foundation work, the studio that let him record on his own schedule without the bus calls and the airport runs. He pivoted publicly from road warrior to coach for up-and-coming musicians, reframing retirement not as an ending but as a shift in how he served the music. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Fans expressing disappointment but also gratitude that he'd given them 50 years. Fellow musicians respecting the rare wisdom of knowing when to step back instead of being carried off. And he didn't stop making music. He just stopped performing it in rooms where the pressure could steal what was left. In 2020, he released The Power of the One, an album that reinforced everything the late career Bootsy had become. A studio-based producer, a mentor, a voice for healing funk that didn't need a stage to do its work. In interviews, he kept circling back to what Cincinnati had taught him, that the city's love had given him humbleness, discipline, and the joy of coming and going as he pleased. And now he was choosing to come and go on his own terms. Not the industry's, not the audience's, not even his body's demands, just his own. And as the bass went quiet on stage, something else got louder, a decades-long fight to make sure the place that made him would never be forgotten. The King Records building on Hackberry Street had been decaying for years. Boarded-up windows and flaking paint, where legends like James Brown and the Isley Brothers once cut records that changed American music. By 2018, the building that represented the entire Cincinnati sound, the place that had shaped young Bootsy's dreams before he ever picked up a bass, was on the edge of demolition. another piece of black musical history about to become a parking lot. But Bootsy wasn't having it. He stepped into the preservation fight not as a celebrity doing PR, but as a steering force, his foundation partnering with city officials and grassroots organizers to landmark the building and launch a multi-million-dollar restoration campaign. There's a street sign near that building now, Bootsy Collins Way, a small piece of concrete recognition that the kid from the neighborhood had earned the right to reshape the neighborhood's future. It wasn't about ego, it was about infrastructure, making sure the next generation of Cincinnati kids would know that greatness had walked these streets and could walk them again. But preservation work took on a different meaning in 2022, when a family tragedy around cardiovascular health hit close enough to turn grief into action. Bootsy and Patty partnered with Mercy Health to launch a fund supporting heart care for underserved patients. The same community-first energy that powered the Foundation's music programs now aimed at keeping people alive long enough to hear the music. It was funk as healing made literal. The man who'd spent 50 years talking about groove as medicine now funding actual medical intervention for folks who couldn't afford it. And he's still here, still working, still recording. Between 2024 and 2025, he dropped Album of the Year #1 Funketeer, sat for long-form interviews with BMI and music journalists, and kept mentoring from his Cincinnati base, proving that retirement from the stage doesn't mean retirement from the mission. The net worth estimates hover around 2 or 3 million, numbers that sound small compared to the moguls and the streaming-era stars, but those numbers miss the point entirely. The real wealth is the estate he owns outright, the foundation that runs on his name and Patty's organization, the royalties that keep flowing every time a producer samples Bootzilla or a DJ drops Flashlight, the influence baked so deep into hip-hop, neo-soul, and modern R&B that you can't separate his DNA from the sound. He once posted on Facebook that money is nice, but real wealth is in experience and caring about what you do with your life. And that philosophy runs through every choice he's made since leaving James Brown's Notebook of Finds. The Goodwill Kid turned his shame into a costume, survived boot camp and built a spaceship, rode the charts to #1 and walked away when the industry shifted, then rebuilt himself through samples and collaborations, and finally through land, legacy, and the kind of quiet power that doesn't need a spotlight to prove it's real. Because Bootsy Collins learned what so many legends never get to. The real power isn't in how loud the crowd screams your name. It's in waking up every morning on land you own, in a city that raised you, with a base that doesn't owe anybody a single note.